In this video, I'm going to go through the adjustment layers and settings that might come up in the exam, but also make sure you check out all the other adjustment layers that I don't mention in this video. I'm going to concentrate on the ones that I know might be asked and I've seen before in exams, but that doesn't mean that the other options are not important. So first of all, let's have a look at the levels adjustment layer. Once I select it, this is what I see in the properties panel. If you remember from the previous video, I already talked about the histogram and how it represents all the tonal values in our images, and that we have the visual indication of shadows, midtones and highlights in them. And the levels works very closely together with the histogram, and it tells us what's happening in the image. But we can do quite a lot of things here. Well, first of all, we can increase the contrast of the image by dragging the white point and the black point closer to the midtones. And you can see the further I drag it, the higher the contrast will get. But at the same time, I'm clipping colors or details, tonal values from the image. So whatever was above the white point here, all these values will be turned into completely white. That's why it's called white point. And anything below the black point will turn to completely black. So this is called clipping, and to be able to see how it looks, you can hold down Alt while you are dragging these black point and white points, and then you can see also on your image which are the areas that's affected. So as the further I drag it to the right, the more areas will turn completely black. So when I let go, I can see what happened. I can drag it back until I get something much less. So something like that, where only the darkest part will turn completely black and be clipped. And here on the right as well, with the highlights, I have the same thing. So if I drag it further right, I will only have a little bit of clipping, mainly here on the boat, which is the brightest part of the image. If I turn off my adjustment now, we can see it's still edit contrast, but without adding a lot of clipped colors to the image. The output levels can be also useful if you want to increase or decrease the brightness of the image. So if I want to brighten up the image, I can drag the output levels like that. But it is not the same as, for example, using curves and the RGB channel. So it's a little bit less useful than that. But you might be able to use this, and also it can be asked in the question and the exam, and what happens if you drag the black slider or black point in the output sliders to the right. And remember, it works the opposite way than the sliders here below the histogram. So in the output levels, if you drag the black point to the right, it will brighten the image. And if you drag the white point to the left, that will darken the image. So it's the opposite as these sliders here on the top. You can also use the levels to compensate a color cast with the set gray point eyedropper. So this tool here, you just simply have to click on the neutral gray part of the image. Maybe if I click somewhere here on the boat where I know it should be gray or white, then it will change the colors in the image. Now it might be a little bit too intense, but then in that case I can just reduce the opacity and I can find a nice setting which works well with this image. So let's see before and after the color correction with the levels adjustment. It's good to know that you have also presets that you can choose from for the levels. But now let's have a look at another adjustment layer. I'm going to go back to adjustments and choose curves. This is also a very, very useful adjustment layer, and there are a couple of things here that you also need to make sure you understand, because it might be a question in the exam. The curves is also good for adjusting colors, so you can again use the gray eyedropper tool and then click on a part of the image which you think should be neutral, so gray or white. As you can see, it works very similarly to levels, but you can also make changes manually by going into the channels, like choosing red for example, and if you feel like it's a bit too much, you can reduce it, or maybe you can go into green and reduce that if you feel like it's a little bit too much to compensate. And curves is a great place for precise adjustments to individual color channels, because as you can see here, we can be very precise and make adjustments to separately highlights, shadows, and midtones for even each of the color channels. If I reset this curves adjustment by clicking on this icon here, I can go back to RGB, and I can show you that if I stay in RGB mode, so the composite channel mode, I can increase the brightness of the image or decrease the overall brightness. And it works better than changing simply the output in levels. So it gives a much better result. We can also create a contrast or add contrast in an image by creating an S-curve, dragging one side up and the left side down. So this is called S-curve, and it works similarly to the levels when we make the shadows darker and make the highlights brighter. So as you can see, if I turn it off, that was before and that is after. At the moment, I am in an editing mode for the curves, but we can also choose a drawing mode. And once I select drawing mode, I can draw into my curves. So I can create a drawing. I can draw the S-curve as well if I want to. And in this case, when the drawing mode is selected, I can smooth the curve with this option. So I can click on it a couple of times and it will smooth out my drawing on the curve. In case we are in the editing mode, we can also use the targeted adjustment tool, with which if I click on a specific part of the image and I drag down or up, I can control those tonal values on the curve itself. So I added a point on the curve according to the tonal values I clicked on, and dragging down, I can darken it, or dragging it up, I can brighten it. So I'm going to make it darker here, and I would like to brighten up these details here. So you can see already I made the shadows brighter and the highlights darker. And this is an inverted S-curve, which is reducing the contrast but revealing more details in the image, a bit similarly to the shadow highlights adjustment. There are also a couple of things in the panel options. So if I go to the properties panel menu, I can see I have here the curve display options. If I select that, I can show you that we can switch to pigment/ink percentage when we will have a different layout of the whole curves panel compared to the default light 0 to 255 option. So these two options mainly change the amount or the numbers visible for input and output, or we can also call it the coordinates of these points. And then we can also change the overlay or this grid, which is displayed at the moment with the quarter tone increments, but we can switch to this one here, which will be 10% increments. And this is something you can change by holding down Alt and clicking on the grid. Also an easy way to change it. And it's also good to know that the curves will behave differently when you work in a CMYK color mode image. So let me just delete these adjustments, and I'm going to change the mode to CMYK on this image. And then if I go back to adjustments, you can also see that we won't be able to use the black and white adjustment and exposure and vibrance in CMYK mode. So that can also be a question, so which adjustment layers are not available in CMYK mode. But I can use the curves. With the only difference then in this mode, the curves will behave differently, so it will work the opposite way. So if I drag it up, then it darkens the image. If I drag it down, it brightens the image. And the reason for that, because for CMYK, the curve display options is on pigment or ink percentage by default, because CMYK is mainly used for printing, while RGB is used on devices that use light to represent colors. So that's what these two options stands for. So levels and curves are the most common questions in the exam, but there are also a couple of other adjustment layers which I'm going to show you in the next video, which you should also make sure to check out before you do the exam.